Hi, welcome to the process of exploring how startups are able to get funding, but perhaps through other mechanisms by which we do normal investing. So I'm John Seacrest from the Seattle Angel Conference. We spend time creating new angel investors by an experiential process. And we start out with the notion of investing in a startup that's going to grow, but that startup frequently is put into a very narrow filter when we're taking equity. And there are other pathways by which you can fund and then get a return from that investment. And today I'd like to introduce Luni Libes, who is the founder of Fledge, an accelerator for conscious companies. And he's going to talk about the pathway that he uses for funding his accelerator.
All right, thanks, John.
Thank you.
All right, so the title of the presentation is You're Doing It Wrong, because as John explained, most early stage startups are about investing in the structure called private equity or preferred equity, and that's not the only choice. So before I get into that, a little bit about me. So I'm a 25-year serial entrepreneur. I did first 20 years in tech doing venture-backed startups. In fact, I was on the other side of the table many times when they sent us preferred equity term sheets and large checks and so forth. And then 5.5, 6 years ago, I jumped ship, left the tech world and joined the world of social good. In fact, the world of for-profit social good. Started Fledge, the conscious company accelerator, started teaching at Presidio graduate school, the first business school in the world to teach how to do good by doing business, and a bunch of other projects too, including a whole series of books. All right, today's talk, in your mind, you should think about this as how to siege a castle, right? So the model we're going to use is this castle out there is the normal way that people fund companies, and we're going to fill in the moat, we're going to knock down the walls, we're going to change the system here. The blueprint for this castle is this book. This is written by Thomas Kuhn back in the 60s. It's The Structure of Scientific Revolutions. Probably you've never read this book, you probably never heard of this book, but you know the idea that's in this book. This is the book that defined the word paradigm. All right, now what is a paradigm? You hear this term battered around all the time. Well, a paradigm is a bunch of ideas, right? It comes from science, right? Thomas Kuhn was a historian of science. So you have a bunch of ideas and a bunch of theories, and you think you know how the world works. And when evidence comes before you that doesn't fit your theory, if you are stuck in a paradigm, then you throw out those ideas. So case in point, there used to be a theory started by ages of time and talked about by Aristotle that the Earth was in the center of the universe. Right? Now, you're going to laugh at that, but for ages and ages, the Earth was in the center of the universe according to every human being on Earth. Right? And then a guy came along called Copernicus who had some different theories, a different theory, but he had different evidence. Well, he was afraid to publish it. He didn't publish it until he died. Right? Another guy came along named Galileo. He was brave enough to talk about this theory while he was still alive, and it didn't go so well for Galileo because everyone said, no, that was wrong. That didn't fit what we see every day. Right? And then eventually, the paradigm shifted. And now today, everybody knows that the sun is the center of the solar system, and there is no center of the universe. Right? So it's possible, given enough evidence, given enough time, given enough people who are digging into the innards of this, that you can change the paradigm. And now if someone came along and said, no, the sun isn't the center, the moon is the center, we would probably ignore that and call him a quack because that doesn't fit what we've been taught. Right? So back to this castle. Well, the castle is that the one and only way to invest in early stage startups is preferred equity. Right? So what we need to do is break down those walls. And here is the guidebook on how to do this. Right? It's a new book. I just published it. It's The Next Step for Investors, Revenue-Based Financing. And in the next few minutes, I'll explain the overview of what that means. All right, it starts like this. Here's the walls of the paradigm. There are about 500,000 new companies formed each year in the United States. Right? Actually rounded down. It's more like 550, but let's just use big round numbers. 500,000, 500,000 new companies get started each year. We know this because the U.S. Small Business Administration and the Kaufman Foundation both measure this, and they've been measuring this for decades. All right, so there's a group called PitchBook. They track what happens in the venture capital world, and according to them, in 2016, 4,115 of those companies got first-time funding from a venture capital firm. Right? Pretty specific. That industry happens to be really well tracked. There's a bunch of different companies that all track these investments, so that number is more or less true, plus or minus 10. We also know that in 2016, the same year, 726 companies that had been funded in the past by venture capitalists had an exit. And an exit is an acquisition or an IPO. Right? So keep these numbers in mind. This is 0.8% of all the startups, all the new companies got funded by VCs, and 0.1% of those startups exited. Those are tiny little numbers. And so the first question you should have when you look at this castle wall is, why on earth are we even bothering with this castle and this paradigm of investing when it only truly affects 0.1% of all the companies that have started up? That's an interesting question to ponder for a moment. All right, now if you talk to venture capitalists, what they'll tell you is that the other 496,000 companies that got started in 2016 were unfundable. And unfundable is in quotes because it's unfundable using their business model. It's not unfundable in general, it's unfundable in their business model, and let me explain what their business model is. All right, it starts like this. There's a bunch of companies out there that are trying to jump over what's called the valley of death. Right? Terrible term, but that's what it feels like when you're there. So you start a company, you usually start it using some money out of your own pocket. You may turn to friends and family, and you get so far, right? You get maybe a prototype out there. If you're lucky, you get a first few customers, and then you need to jump over this hole in the industry. All right, so the hole is the lack of funders that want to take the risk on companies that are brand new. Right? There's actually not that much money in the whole financial system targeted toward that specific moment in time. So it feels like the valley of death to the entrepreneurs. To the funders, to the venture capitalists and the angels, it's an opportunity. What they say, when they look at a company, they say, well, here's what I could pay for it now. Could it possibly be worth 10 times more in the future using my capital to grow and find customers and eventually make profits? Right? That's the 10x gap that they look at. And of course, not all companies can jump that 10x gap or can grow that fast. All right, so why is it 10x? Where does the 10x number come from? So here we are digging further and further into these castle walls, and we get to this chart. Now, this is not a chart I made up. This is a chart that was handed to me by one of the most prolific investors in Seattle. His name is Jeff Entris. He's a friend of mine. He came to my MBA class and taught this. He teaches this at the University of Washington and other universities around town. All right, this is a chart of what a successful venture capital or angel portfolio looks like. Right? Jeff knows this because he's an angel investor, because he works with venture capital firms. He's a co-founder of a business incubator. He lives in this space. All right, it goes like this. For every 10 investments made by an angel or every 10 investments made by a venture capital fund, one of them will actually, in reality, return 10x or more. Right? So if 1 in 10 has returned 10x, they've gotten their money back. And that's it. They've only gotten their money back. So they need some more winners. Well, in a successful portfolio, 2 out of 10, more or less, will return something around 5x. Maybe it's 3x, maybe it's 7x, but it's not quite that 10x they were aiming for. And then 3 of those investments will return pretty much exactly the money they put in. And there's some reasons why it's exactly the money they put in. There's some things in preferred shares called preferences, and one of those preferences is that the investors get their money first if there's an acquisition or any other change of the company. Then of these 10 investments they made, 4 of them are just going to be total losses. They're going to be write-offs. They're going to be zeros, or close enough to zeros to count as zero. And I'm going to say this once again. In a successful portfolio, 1 in 10 is a home run, right? Is a good investment. And 2 in 10 are pretty good, where 5x is considered pretty good, because 3 in 10 are going to be just the money back. And if this is 10 years later, just getting your money back is not very good. And 4 of them are losses. So look at the left column and note that only 3 out of 10 times a successful venture capital firm will be correct. and 7 out of 10 times they'll be wrong. Whereas they thought every single one of these companies had the potential to be 10x. If it didn't have the potential, they didn't invest at all. So we can take the weighted average. So you take 1 at 10, 2 at 5, 3 at 1, the zeros don't count, and you get a weighted average of 2.3x. So the goal of a venture capital or an angel fund is not in fact 10x, right? It's 10x 1 out of 10 times. The actual goal is around 2.5 times your money back, right? That was 2.3. There's some research that show angels have done 2.6. If you talk to enough angels and VCs, you'll see sometimes they do 3, sometimes they do 2. Let's just call it around 2.5 times your money back. All right, so why is it 2.5 times? Well, 2.5 times your money over 10 years is an internal rate of return, an equivalent interest rate of about 15%. Right? And 15% is better than the S&P 500. And if you're going to take the risk of investing in early stage companies, then according to the financial system, you're supposed to get a reward that's better than taking less risk, and less risk would be putting your money in the public stock market, in the S&P 500. So you should do better than that. So historically, that's 7, 8, 9%. This is 15%. That makes total sense if you succeed. Not everyone succeeds, of course. All right, so how do you do this? Right, that's the basic idea of why you hear 10x a lot. How do they make these investments? Well, according to the standard model, inside the castle, they'll tell you there's only 2 ways to invest in startups. One of them is debt. And here's why debt doesn't work for the earliest startups. So in this chart, the green bar represents the money handed from investors to the company. So investors hand a chunk of money to a company in exchange for a bunch of fixed payments over a fixed period of time. That's what defines debt. Problem is that the first bunch of payments are not affordable by the startup because they don't really have any money yet, right? If this is the first money in when it's a prototype or early revenues, and revenues are expected to grow by a huge amount, they just can't afford those first payments, and therefore debt doesn't really work. Secondly, as you saw in the chart before, 7 out of 10 times the companies are failures. And so if you had to charge an interest rate to make a reasonable return to the investors, you would have to charge something like 2.5 times. You'd have to charge 250%. And that would make all the payments unaffordable, and it just doesn't work out. So this is why you only see debt in growth stage, because in early stage, the numbers just don't work out. Which is why the typical way that angels and VCs invest in startups is equity. So here's the chart for equity. Investors hand a bunch of money over to a company who promises them nothing, no repayments. Instead, what they promise is a percentage of the total return when someone else buys the company. So you wait an unknown number of years of time, right? Unpredictable, you never know how long it's going to be. On average, it's about 5, 6, 7 years, but you never know. Sometime later, some other acquirer comes along and says, I really want this company. I think it truly is worth, hopefully, 10x more than those investors put in, and then the investors share in the profits. That works great if and only if the company is in a space that has a lot of acquirers. Right? There is another path out there. It's called IPO, or going public. It just doesn't happen very often anymore. It happens a dozen times a year, maybe 24 times at most. So we're going to just ignore that for the moment. Of those 700 exits that happened back in 2016, about 700 of them were acquisitions. So there is a third way. There's a third way out there that's just not very common and not known yet. It's called revenue-based investing. So it works like this. Again, investors hand a chunk of money over to the company, who then promises to pay a percentage of their revenues back to the investor until a certain amount of money is paid back. And that's it. So those payments are definitely affordable to the company because they're proportional to the revenues, right? No revenues, no payments, higher revenues, higher payments. For the investor, they have a way to get their money out in a still not totally predictable amount of time, but at least forecastable amount of time. So I'll show you some examples of this. You can do this as a loan. It can be structured to look like debt, like a loan. So for example, I, the investor, could hand over $100,000 of my money to a company in exchange for 5% of their future revenues, paid, let's say, monthly, until they've paid me back $200,000, which is a 2x return. Or it could be $250,000, which would be that two and a half times return. You can do the same deal as equity. So instead, and this is the way we do it at Fledge, I could take the $100,000 and I could buy, let's say, 10% of the company, and they could promise to use the same percentage of revenues, right? In this case, 5% of revenues, on a, let's say, a quarterly basis, because quarterly is 4 times a year instead of 12. It's less paperwork. And so they're going to take 5% of the revenues and they're going to buy back half my shares until they've paid me a total of $200,000. So just note, those two deals are the same numbers. $100,000 in, $200,000 out. One is equity, one is debt. That really doesn't matter. The reasons for that are down in the details. The key variables when you're setting up one of these deals is, do you want to do it as debt or equity? Right? It's really who gets the best tax treatment. What percentage of revenues is the right amount to use? Is revenues itself the right number to call for? And generally when I do this, that is the answer, is top line revenues. Usually it's a single digit percentage. So somewhere between 2% and 9% of top line revenues. What's the total amount returned to investors? What is the multiple? Is it 2x or 2.5x or 1.5x? It's totally up to the investor and the company to negotiate that. And those are the two key variables, percentage and x. And you can sit there with a financial model and work out whether you think those numbers come out fair or not. In addition, it's a stock purchase agreement or a debt agreement, and you can add on anything else you want. You can add on whether or not these payments are mandatory or optional. You can add on any of the normal preferences you see in the world of preferred equity, like a board seat or right of first refusal or drag-along rights and so forth. You can do whatever you want on top of this, and you can in fact squeeze this into a standard stock purchase agreement, which is what I do, or squeeze it into a standard debt agreement, which is what I've seen others do. So with this model, what's interesting is that all 500,000, or nearly all 500,000 of those startups become investable. So that word on investable only had to do with the preferred equity model, but in the revenue-based model, pretty much everything's investable. All right, so let's put one together real quick. Right? When I do this in front of a crowd, I like to do this as a workshop and make them actually do the term sheet. So let's just assume you have $100,000 as an investor and you want to go invest in one of these 3 companies I'm about to show you. So 3 questions you should answer. 1, what return on investment do you want from these investments? And some of these are going to be socially conscious investments, and maybe you want a lower return because of that, or maybe you don't. Right? Personally, I don't, but I like to see these companies funded. Second, how patient are you? How long do you want to wait for those returns to come in? And then what else do you need as an investor? Do you need a board seat? Do you need control? Or do you need, or do you trust the entrepreneur to do the right thing? So here's the first company. It's called Jolex. They're in Kampala, Uganda. Kampala is a city of 3 million people who share 1,000 toilets. Jolex is building and deploying for-profit toilets so that everyone in Kampala can use a nice, clean, sanitary facility as often as they need for a tiny fee, 8 cents a use. Jicote is based down in Nicaragua. Nicaragua is the poorest country in Latin America. Jicote is working with small coffee farmers to bring them beehives so that they can grow honey. And then Jicote aggregates that together and exports it to the US and Europe for a profit. Third one's based here in Seattle. It's called Zirconia. And Zirconia has invented a method so that steel never rusts. Right? Giant, humongous, trillion-dollar opportunity, but it's still just a prototype. All right, so let's just assume the following for these 3 companies, which is not true, but for this exercise, let's just assume that we have already met the team and liked them. We already dug through the product or service and liked it, that we've done all the due diligence that we would normally do, and it all has passed just fine. And let's also just assume that these are the 10-year revenue projections for these companies, and you'll just notice that from year 7 onward, we just have the same number, which is $1 million. Because no one ever projects more than 5 years anyway. All right, so here's what we can do. We can take these numbers and put them in a spreadsheet. And we'll have a link to this spreadsheet in the comments below. And in this spreadsheet, we have in column B those same revenue projections. Column C is just showing us what the growth is from year to year. This is a nice simple annual spreadsheet. It's not totally accurate. We have in J1 the amount of the investment, which is $100,000. We have in J2 a place where you can put in the multiple. In this case, I'm just putting in 2. And K2 is just multiplying those two numbers together because sometimes it's not round numbers. So in this case, it's 200,000. It's obvious. And then columns I, J, K, and L are showing 4 different scenarios. What if we took 3% of top line revenue, 5%, 7%, and 9%? Fixed rate of top line revenue, nice simple models. Well, in those cases, in year 1, we would be handing over $100,000 to the company, so that's why it's negative. Parentheses is negative in accounting terms. And then we see in row 6, we see 3%, 5%, 7%, 9% of their first year revenues, right? They have to earn the revenues before you can share. So those are those numbers. And then we can run down the rest of the column, and those are those percentage of revenues for each of those years. At the very bottom, we have a sum total because in this case, column I doesn't get to 2x, only gets to 1.94, but the rest of them do. And we can see that it takes, in this model, 8 years to get paid back at 5%, and 7 years to get back at 7%, and 6 years to get paid back at 9%. That number in row 16 is the internal rate of return. It's an estimate because you'd probably be paid back quarterly or monthly. So it's actually a low estimate of what the actual return would be. And so as an investor, you can sit here now on the spreadsheet and say, okay, if I believe the revenue numbers, and in reality, you wouldn't believe them because you're an investor. But if I believe these revenue numbers and I took, let's say, 5% of their top line revenue with a 2x multiple, I would be earning 17.4% return on investment on this investment if that came true, which is not bad, right? It's in that range of 15% or so. So take a moment, think about one of those 3 companies or all 3 of those companies, and decide, how would you structure this deal? Would you want revenue-based debt or revenue-based equity? Would you want, which percentage of revenue would you pick? What multiple return would you pick? Would it be 2x or 2.5x or 3x or 1.5x? And what other preferences would you throw on the deal? Right? And you can put your answer in the comments, and John and I will comment on your comments afterwards. Now to sum it up, there's this paradigm out there that says all early stage deals have to be done as preferred equity. It's the only reasonable way to invest in companies, and everything that doesn't fit that model is uninvestable, right? That's the paradigm. And again, Thomas Kuhn defined the paradigm. We have a way around that paradigm, a way to shift that paradigm. It is the next step for investors, revenue-based financing. My name is Luni, and if you have any questions, I'm happy to answer them through the comments. Thank you.
Hi, this is John Seacrest again. Take a look at our other work at the SeattleAngelConference.com. Thank you very much.
Thanks for listening. If you want to read more about this topic, come to my website, lunarmobiscuit.com, or my accelerator, Fledge.co.